South Korea, the perfect land of dramas and cutting-edge technology, the dream destination for many. But is everything really as flawless as it seems? Is what you see in the dramas truly real? Today, I'm here to show you a more hidden and forgotten side of Korea, a side where people are left behind, living in the shadows of a world built on illusion. In my previous video, I talked about some slums in Japan, and that video had a big impact. I know there's a strong interest in the lesser-known realities of countries like these. However, as I explained in that video, the slums in Japan are different. Despite the poverty, there is still a sense of order and structure. But in Guryong, things are much more chaotic. What you're about to see today is not just another poor neighborhood. I guarantee you'll be shocked by what you'll witness here. So, if you haven't already, make sure to subscribe to the channel. And now, let's get into the video. To begin this story, there's one important thing you need to understand. We're talking about Gangnam, one of the most upscale neighborhoods in Seoul, the capital of South Korea. You've probably heard of it because of the music video Gangnam Style. Gangnam is a luxurious area where much of South Korea's wealth is concentrated. Its streets are lined with high-end cars and modern buildings. It is here that the elite of Korean society reside, in apartments that cost far more than most people will earn in a lifetime. But here's where things get interesting. What many don't realize is that just a few meters away lies a completely different world. Guryong, or as many call it, the last slum of Gangnam. Yes, it may be hard to believe, but one of the richest and most glamorous areas of South Korea, often used as a backdrop for dramas and luxury brand campaigns, has a slum right next door. And this is no exaggeration. The divide between luxury and poverty is almost literal. A 6-lane highway separates two completely opposite realities. On one side, you have sleek buildings with tinted glass windows, clean and orderly streets, and high-end shopping centers. On the other side, there are makeshift shacks, dirt roads, and people living in conditions that seem to belong to another century. But how did this happen? The story of Guryong begins around the year 1988, at the time of the Seoul Olympic Games. And to understand how it all came to be, we need to look at the broader historical context. Guryong didn't just emerge by chance. It wasn't some spontaneous development. It was a direct consequence of Seoul's rapid urban expansion during the 1980s. At that time, South Korea was undergoing a massive transformation, trying to present itself to the world as a nation that had risen from the ashes of war and poverty to become a modern and prosperous country. And what better way to showcase that progress than by hosting the Olympic Games? When Seoul was chosen to host the 1988 Olympics, the government launched a series of aggressive redevelopment projects to reshape the city's image. They began to massively evict residents from the poorest communities, and it was neither negotiated nor peaceful. They would simply arrive and demolish the houses, often without offering any decent solution for relocating these families. What mattered at that moment was the image Seoul would project to the world, not the well-being of people living in vulnerable conditions. As a result, thousands of low-income families were left homeless, with no idea where to go. These people migrated to areas off the government's radar, far from the eyes of tourists and international cameras. One of these places was Guryong. There, they built makeshift shacks using whatever they could find, pieces of wood, old tiles, or any material that could serve as shelter. What started as a temporary solution ended up becoming the permanent home for many of these displaced people. What makes Guryong's story even more painful is that, while Seoul prospered and modernized all around them, its inhabitants were increasingly forgotten. Gangnam, the district to which Guryong belongs, turned into the financial and commercial heart of the city, attracting numerous businesses, banks, and the Korean elite. Meanwhile, the residents of Guryong watched their shacks deteriorate more and more without any real assistance from the government. It was as if they didn't exist. The rapid development of Seoul brought many benefits to the country as a whole, but it also came at a very high cost. Entire social groups were marginalized and pushed to the outskirts, while the city center shone brightly with luxury and progress. Guryong is the clearest example of this marginalization, the dark side of Seoul's modernization. It represents those who were left behind while the rest of the city advanced. What's most striking is that even today, Guryong still exists, decaying, yes, but still standing. the government's promise to relocate the residents and transform the area into decent housing was never fulfilled because no one can agree on what to do with that land. On one hand, the authorities want to turn the area into a new luxury district, while on the other, resident associations, even under such precarious conditions, fight to keep their homes. It's incredibly sad to see that the promise of modernity was never delivered to these people. But what is life like for these individuals living in such conditions? Now that you know how Guryong came to be, and how the government has practically forgotten its residents, let's dive deeper into the daily lives of the people who live there to try and understand what it's really like. Guryong is a place where about 2,500 to 4,000 people live, but these figures are only estimates because no official census has ever been conducted. It's as if this patch of land were invisible to the authorities. The majority of residents are elderly and poor, many of them living in isolation from society. They don't have the luxury of thinking about retirement or how to spend the rest of their lives in peace, as is often the case in South Korea's wealthier districts. On the contrary, their concerns are much more basic. Where will I find my next meal? Or, how can I keep my house from collapsing on me this winter? The housing in this shantytown is extremely precarious, and that's no exaggeration. The homes range between 16 and 100 square meters. To give you an idea, 16 square meters is about the size of a very small bedroom. These are shacks made of improvised materials like plastic, metal, and even tarps, many of which are flammable, putting the residents at constant risk of fire. In fact, fires in Guryong are not uncommon. There have been severe incidents, like those in 2014 and 2010, which destroyed several homes and left many people homeless. Imagine living in a home that, besides being cramped, has no secure electrical system and no proper insulation. In the summer, the heat becomes unbearable because the shacks absorb all the sunlight. And in the winter, the cold seeps through the cracks in the walls, making the environment freezing and dangerous. In this context, it's elderly people, already vulnerable in any society, who are living in horrific conditions that would be unbearable for anyone. On top of that, many of these residents have no formal employment. They rely on informal jobs, and when they receive help, it's usually from NGOs or local associations. With no stable income and little to no government assistance, survival becomes a daily struggle. There is no support network or organized aid, as there should be for people in such a situation. Another important detail is that, in the absence of an official census of residents, it's very difficult for authorities, NGOs, and other groups to know exactly who needs help. There is no database to understand the community's profile, which greatly complicates the implementation of public policies, social projects, or any other initiative that could actually help. It's as if Guryong were a no man's land in terms of statistics and data. And without this information, the residents remain invisible. They receive no help, and without help, the situation remains the same, or worsens. Meanwhile, the world outside Guryong keeps moving. Gangnam maintains its towering buildings, the famous horse dance, luxury cars drive through the streets, and modern life moves on relentlessly. But just on the other side, in Guryong, the challenges are very real. People tend to see South Korea as a technologically advanced and prosperous country, and that's mostly true. But it's also a place where people like the residents of Guryong are left behind, teetering on the edge of misery, while the rest of the country moves forward without even noticing. And maybe you're asking yourself, but doesn't the government try to solve this situation? Well, the government has made several attempts, but they have often turned out to be disastrous, either because it did nothing or because its efforts missed the mark. Understanding the Korean government's actions is complicated. Since 2011, a plan was launched to relocate the residents and solve the Guryong issue. But that plan remains at a standstill. More than a decade later, it still hasn't materialized. In 2015, a new project was proposed to permanently demolish Guryong and provide subsidized housing for the residents. On paper, the idea looked like the perfect solution: take people out of extreme poverty and place them in more decent housing with proper infrastructure and a minimum level of comfort. However, in practice, progress has been disappointing, to say the least. For the residents, the idea of relocation might sound like a promise of hope, but it also brings tremendous uncertainty. Where will these people end up? Will they really receive the housing they were promised? The longer the government delays action, the more Guryong deteriorates. The shelters are becoming weaker, and the residents' health is worsening year after year. With no solution in sight, the situation only gets worse, and the pressure on the government is growing, not necessarily out of a sense of social responsibility, but rather because having a shantytown like Guryong in the middle of a wealthy district like Gangnam tarnishes the image of modernity South Korea wants to project to the world. Thanks for watching until the end. I hope you understood the message behind this video. Feel free to share your thoughts in the comments. And if you'd like to learn more about Japan's hidden slums, I've already talked about them in another video. It's right here on your screen. Click on it, and I'll meet you there.